There are stories in the Bible that cross centuries and continue touching the human heart as if they had been written yesterday. The journey of Joseph of Egypt is one of them. Beloved son of Jacob, a dreamer since youth, Joseph carried within him a promise that seemed too great for the reality in which he lived. Charles Spurgeon, the celebrated 19th-century Baptist preacher, found in this narrative one of the greatest teachings on waiting that faith can offer. For Spurgeon, Joseph was not merely a character from the past, but a mirror of the human soul before God's timing. While the world measures time in clocks and calendars, heaven measures it in purpose and maturation. Joseph received a clear dream, a vision of greatness, but between the dream and its fulfillment there would be years of silence, injustice, and apparent abandonment. It is exactly in this interval, between the promise and the fulfillment, that the true secret this script intends to reveal resides. Many read Joseph's story only for its glorious ending, forgetting that the true lesson lies in the middle of the road, in what he faced without understanding the reason. To understand Joseph is to understand that waiting is not a punishment, but a process, and it is precisely this process that almost no one has the patience or faith to go through. Joseph was only 17 years old when dreams began to visit his nights. In one of them, sheaves of wheat bowed before his sheaf. In another, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowed before him. These were clear images, almost impossible not to understand. Joseph would rule, Joseph would be exalted, even his own family would bow before him. And the young man, moved by the innocence and enthusiasm of one who had just received a divine revelation, did not hesitate to tell everything to his brothers. Charles Spurgeon used to warn that God reveals the destiny, but rarely reveals the path. He shows the top of the mountain, but does not describe the stones, the valleys, and the falls that exist along the way. Joseph knew what would happen, but had no idea how long it would take, nor how much suffering would be necessary for it to come to pass. Between the dream and the throne of Egypt, 13 long years would pass, years of slavery, unjust accusation, and imprisonment. This is the first great spiritual shock that waiting provokes, discovering that God's promise does not come with an attached schedule. Spurgeon said that true faith is not merely believing that God will fulfill it, but continuing to trust when the fulfillment takes longer than our patience can bear. The dream was given in youth, the fulfillment would only come in the maturity forged by pain. And it is precisely this space between the promise and the fulfillment that reveals the character of the one who waits. The first great blow in Joseph's life did not come from strangers, but from his own brothers. Moved by jealousy and accumulated hatred, they threw him into an empty cistern in the desert, without water, without apparent hope of rescue. There, at the bottom of that dry well, Joseph probably cried out, wept, and pleaded, the scriptures later record, through the mouths of his own brothers, the anguish of his soul in that moment. Charles Spurgeon saw in this scene a brutal and sincere portrait of the beginning of every great trial. It rarely starts gently. It often begins with betrayal, with abandonment, with the feeling that the very ground has disappeared beneath one's feet. From the cistern, Joseph was sold as a slave to Ishmaelite merchants, and by them resold to Potiphar, an Egyptian official. Within a few hours, the boy who dreamed of ruling became another man's property in a foreign land, without family, without name, without voice. Spurgeon insisted that this is the point at which many give up believing in the promise, when present reality completely contradicts the vision received. How can a slave become a ruler? How can someone at the bottom of a well believe he will still rise? The spiritual answer Spurgeon offered was simple and harsh at the same time. The waiting of faith does not eliminate the pain. It moves through the pain, with the certainty that God has not forgotten, even when everything seems to prove the contrary. Joseph did not know it, but that cistern was only the first step of a much longer staircase, and he would need to descend even deeper before beginning to rise. In Potiphar's house, Joseph could have given himself over to bitterness. He could have lived as a rebellious slave, dragging his feet and serving with a heart full of resentment for what his brothers had done. But the scriptures show something remarkable. Joseph served with excellence, and the Lord was with him in everything he did. His competence and integrity were so evident that Potiphar made him administrator over his entire house, entrusting him with everything he owned. Charles Spurgeon saw in this a powerful spiritual principle. True waiting is not passivity, it is faithfulness in the place where you are, even if that place is not what you dreamed of. Joseph was not waiting with folded arms for the promise to be fulfilled. He was being shaped, serving with excellence even in slavery. But then came the hardest test. Potiphar's wife harassed him repeatedly, and Joseph, with rare integrity, refused to sin against God and against his master. And what was the reward for this faithfulness? A false accusation. He was slandered, humiliated, and thrown into prison, punished unjustly for having done what was right. Spurgeon highlighted this point as one of the most painful in the Christian life. Doing what is right and still being crushed by the consequences. Human justice failed Joseph, but Spurgeon reminded that faithfulness to God is never recorded in vain, even when men forget, even when the reward is slow to come. Potiphar's house taught Joseph to serve with excellence, even without recognition, a lesson that prison would soon deepen even further. Joseph was thrown into prison for a crime he did not commit. There was no fair trial, no witnesses in his favor, no one to defend him. From the position of administrator of Potiphar's house, he fell to the lowest possible rank, prisoner, treated as guilty, forgotten within the cold walls of an Egyptian dungeon. Charles Spurgeon considered this perhaps the cruelest moment in Joseph's story, because in it there was not even the justification of wrongdoing. He was not paying for a sin committed. He was paying for the good he had done. And yet, the scriptures repeat the same phrase they had said in Potiphar's house. The Lord was with Joseph. Even in the darkness of injustice, God's presence did not abandon him. Spurgeon taught that there are trials with no logical explanation, pains that make no sense from a human point of view, and it is exactly in these moments that faith is most deeply refined. There is no spiritual growth without silence, and there is no silence heavier than the one in which God seems absent, while injustice triumphs. Joseph, in prison, again stood out for his excellence. The jailer placed the other prisoners under his care. Even in the lowest place, he continued serving with integrity, continued being someone who could be trusted. Spurgeon saw in this the true test of waiting. It is not waiting in comfort, hoping circumstances will improve, but continuing to be faithful exactly when everything around cries out that faithfulness is not worth it. And it was there in prison that God would begin to open the next door, through two men whose dreams Joseph would also interpret. In prison, Joseph met two men who had served directly under Pharaoh, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. Both had disturbing dreams, and Joseph, guided by the Spirit of God, interpreted them with precision. The cupbearer would be restored to his position in 3 days, while the baker would be executed. Faced with this good news, Joseph made a simple and human request, asking to be remembered and mentioned favorably to Pharaoh so that he might be freed from that place. There was concrete hope there. An influential man who would return to a position of trust beside Pharaoh himself, promising to intercede for him. But the biblical text brings one of the most painful phrases in the entire narrative. The chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Charles Spurgeon pointed to this moment as one of the most challenging tests of faith, when the human help in which we place our hope simply fails. Joseph waited days, weeks, months, and nothing happened. According to scholars of biblical chronology, 2 more long years would pass in prison after this episode. Spurgeon taught that God often allows human doors to close precisely so that it becomes clear that deliverance will come by his hand, not by the goodwill of men. The cupbearer's forgetfulness was not an accident without purpose. It was part of the final polishing of Joseph, the last test of patience before the complete turn of his story. It was necessary for all human hope to be exhausted so that divine intervention would become unmistakable. We arrive at the heart of this script, at the teaching Charles Spurgeon drew with the greatest intensity from Joseph's life. The true secret of waiting is not inertia, it is silent preparation. Most people understand waiting as a state of pause, as if life were suspended until the promise is fulfilled. But Joseph never stopped. In Potiphar's house, he administered with excellence. In prison, he cared for the other prisoners responsibly. At every stage of his trial, he was being molded in character, in wisdom, in the capacity to lead, in compassion for those who suffer. Spurgeon said that God never wastes the time of waiting. He uses it as an invisible school, where the heart learns lessons that no quick success could teach. If Joseph had risen to the Egyptian throne straight from his father's house, without the cistern, without slavery, without injustice, without prison, he would have governed with the arrogance of a spoiled young man. But the Joseph who came to power was different, humble, wise, capable of forgiving his own brothers, capable of administering an entire nation amid a great famine. Waiting did not delay him. It shaped him. This is the secret that almost no one understands. The years of silence are not an interruption of God's purpose. They are an essential part of it. While the world measures success by speed, heaven measures it by the depth of the transformation that happens within us during the delay. To wait on God, Spurgeon taught, is to keep serving, keep trusting, keep being faithful, even without any sign that the end is near. 2 years after the cupbearer's forgetfulness, Pharaoh himself had dreams that no one in all of Egypt could interpret. Wise men, magicians, and counselors failed before the visions of the fat and lean cows, the full and withered ears of grain. It was only at this exact moment that the cupbearer finally remembered Joseph and mentioned him to Pharaoh as the man capable of interpreting dreams. Joseph was hastily taken from prison, shaved, given a change of clothes, and brought before the most powerful ruler of the known world. Charles Spurgeon saw in this instant the clearest proof that God operates with a precision human eyes cannot anticipate. It was not a second earlier nor a second later. The moment Joseph would be useful coincided exactly with the moment Egypt needed him most. If Joseph had left prison only a few months earlier, he might have found closed doors. If he had left later, perhaps the opportunity would already have passed. Spurgeon used to say that God is not like a human clock, which lags or runs ahead due to mechanical flaws. He is as precise as the creator of time itself. Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dreams with wisdom from above, revealing the 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine, and proposed a plan of administration so solid that Pharaoh himself, impressed, instantly elevated him to the position of governor over all Egypt, second only to the sovereign himself in authority. In a single day, the forgotten prisoner became the second most powerful man in the nation. What men had taken years to destroy, God restored in a few hours, at the exact moment the promise was meant to be fulfilled. At only 30 years old, Joseph took administrative command of all Egypt, and in the following years led the nation with a wisdom that would save not only the Egyptians, but also the neighboring peoples during the great famine that would afflict the region. And it was exactly this famine that brought Joseph's own brothers to Egypt in search of food. Without imagining, they stood before that same boy they had thrown into a cistern and sold as a slave. Charles Spurgeon was deeply moved by this encounter, for in it is revealed the pinnacle of the purpose of all Joseph's waiting, not merely his personal exaltation, but the salvation of an entire family, including those who had wounded him most. Facing his terrified brothers, Joseph did not use his power for revenge. On the contrary, he wept, identified himself, and spoke one of the most profound lines in all of Scripture, that though they had intended evil against him, God intended it for good, to accomplish what was happening that day, the preservation of many lives. Spurgeon saw in this declaration the perfect summary of the whole journey. The pain, the betrayal, the slavery, and the imprisonment were not wasted. They were the instruments God used to position Joseph exactly where he was needed, at the exact moment he was needed. The glory of the throne only made sense because it came after the trial of the cistern, of Potiphar's house, and of the dungeon. Without the valley, there would be no mountain. Without the waiting, there would be no purpose fulfilled in its fullness. Joseph's story was not written merely to be admired. It was written to be lived. Charles Spurgeon insisted that every believer carries, in some way, a dream given by God, a promise not yet completely fulfilled. And just like Joseph, many of us go through our own cisterns, our own houses of Potiphar, our own unjust prisons, moments when we did what was right and still suffered the wrong consequences. The question Spurgeon left echoing was simple. Will you wait bitterly, or will you wait being shaped? The waiting of faith does not mean folding your arms and hoping everything resolves itself. It means continuing to serve with excellence where you are, continuing to be upright, even when no one notices, continuing to trust even when human help fails and God's silence seems endless. Remember, Joseph did not know at the bottom of the cistern that 13 years later he would be seated beside the throne of Egypt. You too do not know exactly when your turnaround will happen, but you can choose, today, to be faithful in the process, trusting that God is never late, even when he seems to forget. God's timing is perfect, and what men mean for evil, he can transform into a blessing for the good of many. If this message touched your heart, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave your like and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next content that will continue strengthening your faith.